Innovation to me is about it's a new and better way to solve a defined problem. If you are solving the old problem, you're probably going to get disrupted. If you recognize that, hey, disruption is now redefined a new problem that you have to solve, that's opportunity. It could also be taking the same problem and solving it in a new, kind of a more effective way.
I'm Dave, and I'm here with another Dave. Really excited, looking forward to this one. We're going to talk about how better ways of working help with creating disruption in a market or in an industry. So that's coming up next on Better Ways of Working. Welcome, everybody. But before we get started, I do want to give a little bit of disclaimer. Today's guest I've actually worked with before, so I want to say this up front. The views and the stories we are going to share are our own. We're not representing any current or past employers. We're just two guys reflecting on lessons from our careers. So I want to introduce you to Dave Stagney, somebody I've had the privilege to work with, and I'm really excited that we get to collaborate in this project. So Dave, welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Dave. It's great to see you again. It's been too long.
Indeed.
Yeah, I'll just start out a little bit, my background here. I've been in aerospace about 20 years here, with a little bit of a detour in the financial industry, which we can talk. And I'm currently living in Richmond, Virginia. I got a 12-year-old daughter who I'm also trying to encourage to be an engineer. So hopefully she'll see this someday and follow along.
Excellent.
Growing up, I was definitely really lucky. I was one of those kids that kind of knew what I wanted to do. I always wanted to go to aerospace engineering. There was really two things that kind of sprouted me in that direction. I loved figuring out how things work. When I was a kid, I would ask my parents to take me to yard sales. I'd buy old radios, TVs, any gadget that was broken. I could take it home, take it apart, try to figure out what was going on in there. At the same time, two of my uncles, who I really idolized, were both pilots in Vietnam. And the stories that they would tell and the pictures that they had were just amazing, and it inspired me to go into this area. I was when I went to engineering school, mechanical engineering, and I was fortunate to get a co-op job, which was great, at a small little aerospace company in Buffalo, New York. And it was perfect. The engineers, were designing really cool stuff. I could figure out how it worked. And, they were building airplanes and rockets that were, supporting the country. And so that was really, really inspiring for me and kind of fit the theme of my childhood. The first summer they had me in the machine shop. I was turning parts. And the next summer I was actually in a class 10,000 clean room. And I was putting together valves for satellites and launch vehicles. So I spent a couple years in engineering and I absolutely loved it. But then I noticed that we had a lot of quality problems, cost problems, production problems. And I kind of wanted to figure out how those things worked also. More than just from a technical side, I wanted to kind of figure out how the organization and the business worked. So I went back to school for a couple of years to study operations management.
Okay, great. So what were some of the early influences on how you think about disruption in work?
Well, it's kind of interesting because really, I didn't really even think about disruption, honestly, until a couple of years ago. I didn't realize that really that's kind of what I had been doing for my whole career, which was kind of innovating and transforming, pretty much every process I could get my hands on. But I just never really used that term. I think for me, I just had this natural curiosity and, wanted to take things apart, not just from a yard sale, but from a technical or a business or operational perspective, take them down to the kind of the most fundamental level and try to figure out if there was a different way to solve the problem. I'll go back. I think to answer your question more directly, probably one of the really formative things in my life happened when I was in elementary school. We were living in New Hampshire at the time, and my father wanted to be an entrepreneur. I remember getting into this big truck with him. I was probably, second grade or something like that. And we drove for a few hours. We get to this small little metal building. It's off the side of the road. It's in a forest. It's at this bottom of this giant hill. And I remember walking into the building, and the back wall wasn't metal. It was just this big stone slab of the mountain with a pipe sticking out of it. So my dad takes this big hose off the truck and he connects it up to the pipe. And I didn't realize it was actually a spring water, and he had this mobile bottling machine. And his idea was to sell this pure spring mountain water from this little town in Maine called Poland, Maine.
Awesome.
Yeah, looking back, I mean, it was a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
But my dad, really learned the hard way. People would tell him, why would I pay for water? I can get it for free out of my faucet. It turns out, he was just really a couple of years early. Honestly, since that time, bottled water has pretty much taken over the world. I saw one estimate on Google. It said, sales right now of bottled water are estimated something like $300 billion per year globally. So he definitely had the
Wow.
right idea just at the
Yeah.
wrong time.
Right.
Thinking about disruption, it wasn't really the product itself, the water. I mean, but it was the idea, the convenience of taking the water and putting it in the plastic bottle, that small little plastic bottle that you can carry with you wherever you're going to go, throw it in your backpack, do whatever. That's the thing that disrupted the way that people kind of thought about water. And that really stuck with me over time, is that it is something as simple as water, or how you carry around water, can be transformed in such a huge way and create this brand new industry, and really change, the way people kind of live their life every day. Why can't we do that with everything else? Is disruption going to happen for everything? Maybe the lesson for me was, maybe even the most basic things that you take for granted every day might actually be a huge, massive opportunity if you kind of challenge some of those fundamental assumptions that you have.
So, what were some other pivotal moments that really shaped your leadership approach involving disruption?
For me, when I was in grad school for operations, I had two guest lecturer professors that came in that really kind of shaped a lot of my thinking. The first one was Michael Hammer. And if you've ever heard of him, he was the father of what they call process reengineering. The most famous example of reengineering is Progressive Insurance. And if you remember, they pretty much redesigned the way that auto insurance claims were done. I think this was probably in the 90s sometime. And the key concept was really this idea of rearranging the order that you do things. So fundamentally kind of questioning, from an auto insurance claim, why do you have to wait until after the customer has gotten in an accident, right? After they don't have a car, they don't know what's going to happen, and their life is really kind of upended, to then go through all of the really time consuming steps, like figuring out, how much it's going to cost, figuring out when you can approve the claim, and if they're going to get a check, and how, you're going to mail it to them. All those things take a long time while the customer is really in a very difficult situation. And Michael Hammer said, well, it turns out we can actually do all of those things ahead of time. We know, the type of car you're driving, and we know, likely how much it would cost to fix that car given certain different types of accidents. So basically they set a goal and said, we're going to do all that work ahead of time. And the goal would be to drive out to the customer and give them a check within 1 hour. Right. It's totally disruptive from a kind of a competitive standpoint. You can imagine being one of their competitors when they introduce that new process, like, hey, we'll get you a check in 1 month. And Progressive is saying, get you a check in an hour. I think there's pretty
And as a
much.
proud customer in a recent accident, I used the app and it was pretty smooth.
That's pretty amazing now, right? But this
Yeah.
was like 30 years ago, right? Another one that really stuck out for me was Clayton Christensen. And he's the author of the book called The Innovator's Dilemma. If you've ever heard or read of that book, I quote it all the time. It's sitting on my
You've
desk.
mentioned it before. I've heard you talk about it before. Yeah.
And in that book, he goes through this kind of series of case studies about disruption and how different companies and different industries get disrupted. And the main example that he gives is in the disk drive industry, which is a little outdated now with all the technology that we use now. But it's a pattern that I've seen time and time again. You have people who operate under a fundamental set of assumptions, and the companies and the way that people work, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, it is really designed around operating around those kind of key assumptions that you have. And big companies will continue to invest their time and effort in solving the problem around those products that they have that are really successful and very profitable for them. So you think about, in early days, big gigantic mainframe computers, they were trying to store more and more and more data on these gargantuous, room-sized computers. Well, along comes Steve Jobs, and there's a desktop computer. Well, now, you don't need this, gigantic, huge magnetic drive that's in a room. You need something that's actually smaller and cheaper and something very, very different. It's a different problem that you're trying to solve. And a big company is going to look at that and say, well, maybe that's interesting, but that's not what our customers want. And that's not where all the profit is. Why are we going to sell something that, we have a lot less profit and a lot less certainty on? So they don't invest in that. And the new disruptors come in and completely put them out of business. And this pattern continues to happen over time. Went from your desktop computer, then to a laptop computer, then to your iPod, right? And then to your smartphone, then to your smartwatch. Everything's getting smaller and cheaper. And it turns out, in every one of those generations, pretty much the incumbents got wiped out. And so that pattern of, why do big companies invest in these big, giant guaranteed products is because that's what their shareholders are expecting them to do. But they sometimes don't realize that they're going to get disrupted by doing it.
So let's talk a little bit more about the word disrupt or disruption. So how would you define it?
Yeah, it's certainly a good buzzword.
Yeah.
that I use a lot. I actually think about that there's kind of three terms that people use kind of interchangeably, and it's probably good to kind of differentiate between them. First, you have disruption, right? You have innovation, and you have transformation. Which we use a lot. So maybe let me kind of talk about those. I think they're kind of different forces. Disruption to me is what we were just talking about with the disk drive. It's a shift in the entire system, right? The rules of the game actually change. You have new technologies, you have new demands from different customers, you have maybe regulatory changes, have, cost pressures, something globally is happening that change your old assumptions that you're operating, and those become obsolete, right? Something your customers have actually redefined what is valuable to them. And it usually kind of comes from outside, but it forces you to change internally. To me, then disruption kind of triggers a change in your strategy, right? And if you don't change your strategy, then you can go out of business. But it then triggers you internally to innovate, right? Innovation to me is about, it's a new and better way to solve a defined problem. If you are solving the old problem, you're probably going to get disrupted. If you recognize that, hey, disruption is now redefined a new problem that you have to solve, that's an opportunity. It could also be taking the same problem and solving it in a new, kind of a more effective way. You know now what the rules are, and you can apply a different set of, ways to solve that problem. It's kind of really intentional. Oftentimes when you're innovating, it's not just, back to the Michael Hammer example, it's not just the product or the technology, it's the process, it's the culture, it's the ways of working. I've really been looking at a lot of the stuff that you've been doing, Dave, and that is innovation in terms of how people think about what they're doing, how they're spending their time, which is really, really inspiring. I love all the stuff that you're working on.
Thank you very much. That's what I'm going for.
I haven't read your second book yet. I apologize, but I'll get to it.
I'll get you a copy somehow. And for those of you that are wondering, it's called Who Killed Agile, which is available now on Kindle. So there's there's my plug.
There's your plug. Yes, thank you. But that's, you're in that, you're talking a lot about different ways of working and how that you're innovating in terms of the culture that you have and how people work together. And that requires a lot of clarity. You have to really understand and clearly define what is the problem you're trying to solve, and what assumptions you're working under. So again, disruption kind of creates that external pressure. It creates the urgency for you to do something different. You then have to set a different goal. I always love the big, hairy, audacious goals are really
BHAG,
inspiring
yeah.
to me. We can talk about some of those as we keep going here.
Yeah.
And then you got to redefine the problem, right? So the rules have changed. You got to figure out what you need to do. And you got to define your problem. You got to understand the assumptions that are holding you back. And then you
Hmm.
can innovate when you kind of break free of some of those old assumptions and focus on the new problem. And the last one I mentioned is transformation. That then is kind of the process of implementing the innovation, right? Or implementing the change, the response to the disruption. It could be your strategy, your organization, your culture, your product, your technology, kind of all those have to align together in order to, be successful.
And there's change management and adoption. And I think we could spiral on just on that one alone, right? How to get that to be successful, the transformation. Yeah.
Exactly.
So let's talk about some examples of true disruption from your career.
Yeah, the few of these are really interesting and I'd love to kind of chat through them.
Hmm.
Again, this is the disruption to me is that, when the rules of the game are changing and that kind of sets the stage for doing something different. I'll go back to one example that is not aerospace, but was really kind of foundational in my career. That happened when I came here to Richmond. I started working at Capital One. Um, and I was able to kind of bring my operation skills over to a different industry. I really wanted to learn digital. I wanted to learn agile and finance as well. So every year, Rich Fairbanks, who is the CEO, he's the founder of Capital One, has this huge strategy meeting where he brings everyone together. And it was perfect because I had just started. Here I am brand new into this industry thinking, what am I getting myself into? Am I really going to be able to do this? So maybe like 2012, 2011, something like that. It was maybe a couple of years after the housing bubble and the market crash and everything like that. A lot of new regulations, a lot of changes in the financial industry. And Rich was really good at kind of thinking ahead about the industry and where things were going. And he recognized at the time that big banks, credit card companies at the time, were making a really large percent of their profit on the late fees and interest charges. And I remember Rich, sitting there in this beautiful old theater downtown Richmond, and he's walking us through this, and he says, I just don't think that's the right thing to do. From a reputation standpoint, from a business model standpoint, I don't think the regulators are going to like this going forward, and I just don't think it's the right thing to do. And in the meeting, he challenged the entire company to kind of disrupt their business model. Hey, this is what, the majority of what the industry is doing to make our profit. And I think we should challenge that assumption that that's the only way that we're going to make our money going forward. And I don't want to wait around until someone tells us that we have to change. I want you all to go and figure out a different way to operate the company. And so he kind of recognized that, disruption was coming. And again, it was for him, it really was a values perspective. Hey, people they're maybe in debt, maybe they lost their job, maybe they got sick, and I just don't think that's the right thing to do. So let's
Yeah,
think
you're
out
taking
something different.
advantage of people that are going through difficult times, but reframing like where's the value for our customer, right? When they're, in whatever phase of life they're going through, right?
Exactly.
So that's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that was the disruptive push that he gave. And then he challenged the company to kind of innovate and come up with different solutions about how to, change that business model. So again, to me, it's that really the disruption came from changing that kind of mental model, or call it paradigm, that you're operating under, right? What are those key assumptions, nobody talks about, right? But they completely define how you spend your time at work, right? I mean, it's very different if you say, hey, our goal is to sit here and maximize the amount of fees that we're charging and the amount of interest that we're collecting, right? That's going to define what people are doing, how they're spending their time, how they're, solving problems, what sort of systems they're putting in place, right? What sort of metrics they're using, right? And if instead you say, our goal is to provide credit and to help people when they get into debt, help them get out of debt, that's a very different problem that you're trying to, and by the way, make money while we do that, right? Right. But if that's a fundamentally different problem that you're trying to solve, that's going to completely change, everything that people do at work during the day. So I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah,
But that
absolutely
for me, that
does.
was a
Yeah,
really, really kind
that's
of fundamental example.
yeah, no, that's great because it shows how much leadership can set the course of a ship, so to speak. So are you going to the north or are you going to the east just by reframing the problem and then letting the folks figure out how they're going to solve it? And those could be two very different outcomes, right? We talk a lot about outcomes, and outcomes lead to impact and other things, and it's wild how just reframing it can get you to a totally different direction. So why does this disruption also depends on how, right? And so I think that ties into that because like we're talking about, you reframe the problem, you're not giving the team the solution, but you're kind of letting them figure out the how, but it really sets the boundaries, like what's in scope, what's out of scope.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's, again, how, a lot of people spend their time thinking in a particular paradigm. And like I mentioned, it's just the we call it group think or whatever, the assumptions that you have. You don't even realize it, but there are a certain unwritten set of rules. Maybe they're written, in your industry or in your company or organization, your family, whatever it is. I think it's always good to take a step back and kind of maybe even just write those down and again, challenge them back to the spring water one. Why does water have to come out of your faucet only, right?
Hmm.
When you kind of think about the rules or think about those assumptions differently, that's when you can have really a huge opportunity for disruption.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like the jobs to be done approach, right? There's that famous approach where, people aren't buying a quarter-inch drill bit. What they're buying is something to help them put a hole in the wall so they can hang a picture or whatever, right? That's the problem to solve is how to hang a picture, not the drill bit. So, as you were talking, I was also thinking about really understanding the job to be done.
It's a great way of thinking about it. Exactly. That way you're not stuck in, how do I make a better drill bit, right?
Yeah. Yeah, understand the problem of the customer, and especially in Agile, of product ownership or product management, right? Really understanding who it is you're serving and what is it that gives them value, or jobs to be done. The milkshake thing, right? Why did all of a sudden McDonald's milkshakes become a very popular item in the morning? Because people with long commutes, they could enjoy them. They slowly melted, and they were less messy than trying to eat a banana or a bagel with cream cheese on the way to work. Cool. So let's dig into the process a little bit here. Walk through of a product life cycle you've experienced that's led to disruption or involves the disruption process we've been talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Let's we can go into an example that you and I both lived through. In aerospace. So maybe you can jump in here and add some
Yeah.
color. We were at Pratt Whitney and launched the GataWorks organization. Obviously we can't go into a lot of specific details here.
Go see the disclaimer at the beginning of the video.
There's lots of articles publicly written about
Yes, there's
this,
public
and
articles that we'll
you
be
know,
referring to.
you and I can kind of tell our side of the story here. But I think it's a great example. And this started, I think about it's like maybe 2018, 2017. The company, Pratt Whitney, makes jet engines. Fantastic, amazing company. Just had a 100th anniversary.
Yes, it's 100th year. It's a great company. I love working for them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
amazing, amazing
To another
people.
100 years.
And around that time, the company got a lot of feedback that its technology and product development processes were just too slow and too expensive. The ultimate outcome of those processes are fantastic. The F-135 engine, it's a main engine for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, right? I mean, hands down, one of the greatest engines ever built, right?
And it's
40,000
the
pounds
only
of
engine on the F-35.
yes, the one and only. I think when they launched it, at the time, it had like 14 times better safety record than the previous generation of engines. I mean, really, really amazing, right? So the technology development, the product development process wasn't broken, right? It was did exactly what it wanted, but there was this disruption going on in the aerospace industry, certainly in the defense area. you know, Customers, the Department of War and others, right, don't have now going forward. You don't have 2 decades and $10 billion to invest in every new engine. That's a different problem to solve. Sometimes you need to do that, and sometimes you need to do something very different. So at the time, Matthew Bromberg, he was the president of Pratt Military Engines. And he came down and he challenged us. I don't know if you remember, if you were there, but he said, guys, I need you to cut the cost and lead time by 50%, right? This wasn't going to be your traditional Lean Six Sigma ACE project, right? It wasn't going to get us where we needed. We needed to kind of fundamentally challenge the status quo. And what were those rules of the game that were defining that kind of long cost structure? Really kind of rethink all of that. And that was something I know that the team absolutely reveled in. At the same time, this was when they were thinking about these smaller, cheaper, uncrewed aircraft and debating whether or not those what they call CCA, collaborative combat aircraft, were going to be the next thing. You have hundreds of small little things versus, big 6th-gen traditional fighter aircraft. And I don't think anyone still has the answer to any of that yet. So I won't go into that. But, we kind of started with two things. We said, first of all, like, what's the actual problem we were trying to solve? Right? Are we, from back to the kind of the innovator's dilemma, are we just going to continue to produce bigger, more powerful, more, fuel efficient engines? Or is there maybe something different that the customer wants and needs to solve their problem? And again, secondly, what are the key assumptions? What are the rules of the game that we're kind of living by? And, this was kind of a really, really interesting opportunity to kind of put some of those things out to work that I just talked about. So, kind of fundamentally from the rules of the game, there was kind of two main branches. Typically a program would start with thousands of what they call requirements. If you're not in the aerospace industry, it's a list of the things that the product or the process shall do, right? And I think there's tens of...
Thou shalt provide XYZ and 4.3.2.1 states.
Exactly. The engine shall weigh no more than X number of pounds, whatever it is, right? All those things, a lot of them came from failures in the past, right? So they added in requirements to make sure you weren't going to repeat the same mistakes that you did in the past. But literally you'd have, 10, 20,000 of those requirements. And before you could even move on to a design review, you had to justify and show how you were going to satisfy every single one of those requirements, right? And they're all important, but they're all treated equally. And by satisfying all of those requirements, does anyone possibly know whether or not you're kind of sub-optimizing or adding in extra cost or complexity that may or may not be necessary to actually solve the problem that you're trying to solve, right? Which is produce an aircraft that can achieve a certain mission that you're trying to win. The other rule that we kind of challenged was that the technology programs were using the same quality system that the rest of the company was using for production. Right? And the quality system, again, if you're not in aerospace, is a kind of a whole set of rules that you operate by to make sure that your product is going to consistently and safely and reliably do what you need it to do. And certainly these are products where literally people's lives, are resting on the performance of these products. And so the quality system is fundamentally important to everything you do. But and they've been, the quality system of Pratt has gone for 100 years, right? And it's fantastic. It does exactly what it needs to do, right? But maybe if you're doing a prototype or you're developing some new technology, especially if you're doing something that isn't going to fly, and you're trying to prove out different concepts or develop, really innovative new products, maybe you don't have to use those same rules. during that early development phase that you're going to use later on once you know exactly what the product is and you need to build it reliably, right? So maybe there were some rules that were kind of tying our hands behind our backs kind of voluntarily, right? So those were the kind of the paradigms or the key assumptions that we kind of disrupted internally, right? That the first program that we did, we literally made 3 requirements for the engine. That was it. A certain amount of thrust, a certain size, and a certain cost. And that was it. And the next thing we do is we created this kind of, we called it a risk-adjusted quality system. Based on what you were trying to do, you could kind of tailor the rules. The chief engineer and the program manager could kind of, write down the rules that they were going to operate that were appropriate for that project. And the result was game changing. I mean, the first project, we were 50% cheaper and faster, and we only got better from there. I don't know, Dave. I mean, do you have any observations on that? I think there's certainly we also added agile in there as well. But I'd love to
Yeah,
kind of hear
and
what you
and
thought.
yeah, so collaboration, and we talk about this on this channel, right? You, as a leader, you helped set up the culture basically for us to maximize collaboration, not just amongst us as the teams, but even with our customer. And I think, from that standpoint, collaborating with a customer is also an important part. It's in the agile principles, et cetera. And I think, well, in general, when I look back in my career, right, customers want to be collaborated with. I think sometimes, you or others, if you're in this boat, you're seen as an expert. I think customers do want to tap into your expert, but they also want you to challenge them when they ask for something and it can't be done, right? Or there's a better way to do it. And sometimes we kind of be hesitant about it, but that's where we want to, and I'm seeing this in other industries as well, where now we're trying to maximize the collaboration within the organization and with the outside customer to really bring a better product to market, because it was Steve Jobs that said, people don't know what they want until they see it. Or Henry Ford said, when he asked about transportation, what do you want? People would say a faster horse. They had no concept of a car when the automobile was starting out, right? So as the expert, collaborating with your customers and shaping that product, and again, doing things in an iterative and incremental way, which you really supported us. And I really appreciated that. Like, okay, here's what we're doing at the end of this sprint. Here's what's coming up at the end of the next sprint, right? And getting that feedback and incorporating that feedback. And I really think that was also a major part of the success.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another great example. Thank you for that. No, and you were key in that, really helping us to be deliberate about that, right? I mean, because there's getting feedback from customers, but then there's actually really collaborating with them, right? And I think those are actually different things, right? You can do a survey, or you can
Hmm.
sit in a meeting and kind of ask the customer, well, what do you want, right? But when you actually go down and say, okay, these are the priorities for this sprint, right? In this order, these are the outcomes that we're going to, define for this sprint. And by the way, these are the things that are going into our backlog that we're not going to do
Hmm.
in this sprint. Are you
Hmm.
okay with that? Right. And actually putting that in a structured way so that you can talk through that and understand those different trade-offs, right? Not everyone's going to see it that same way, but I think that's a huge, huge piece of collaboration. And then setting yourself up to, at each sprint review, go through the outcome with the customer. Hey, here's what we actually did, and here's what it looks like. That really changes the nature of the relationship. Again, you could start with 10,000 requirements, right? And then have a huge meeting where you're going to go through and say, we're going to spend our time on the 17 requirements that we're not quite meeting, and here's what we're going to do to fix that, and here's our milestones, and here's our schedule. Again, that's one way of doing it. If you know exactly what the answer is and you know exactly what you're going to
If you've
need to
done it
do,
before 1,000
right?
times, that makes sense, right? So in my career, I'm not just talking, working with you, but in general, like how many times when you get a lot of requirements and you think like, yeah, this is it, and you deliver it, and no, that's not what I want. It's just a heartbreaking, place to be in a meeting when your customers are like, no, that's not what I was thinking.
And maybe now you're under contract, right? You've got,
Right.
a lot of bigger challenges that are going to happen when you realize, okay, that we're solving the wrong problem, or we're operating under
Yeah.
the kind of the wrong assumptions, right?
If you spend 6 months working on that problem to realize that wasn't the right problem, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's demoralizing.
There was a really good example of this. This was, I don't know if you remember this one, but a customer came to us and they said, they wanted us to design a fan for them. The fan is kind of the first stage on a jet engine. It kind of produces the majority of the thrust. So what you see when you look in the front of the jet engine. They kind of wanted to understand, well, what's the state of the art of this? How much thrust can you produce with this? And we think we'd really ultimately like to do a 3D printed fan that, what's kind of possible. And kind of the typical way we would approach that is, we'd want to list out all the requirements, right? We'd want to make a huge program, and we'd want to do, a massive amount of analysis to figure that all out, right? So that you don't fail the test, because you're going to put a lot of time and effort into the test. So the first thing we did is we said, well, let's just, we already have a model. We kind of think we know what it is. Well, let's just use the first sprint to basically print the fan and test it. And then we'll use that data to calibrate the model. Right. And that's a very different outcome, right? The goal of the first sprint is not to test your prototype. Iterative design is something that a lot of companies do, right? And it's been done for a long time. But when you think about, well, again, what's the problem that we're actually trying to solve? We want to know if our models actually are accurate and can allow us then to design and build the right product going forward. So that was the first thing. So we built it, we tested it. Of course, it didn't work. Well, maybe it worked, but it wasn't that great. But we brought the customer in. The customer's standing there and they're looking at it and they say, you know what? Actually, now that I see it, I want it to look like this. And it completely changed the design. They came up with an actual different design of how they wanted their aircraft to kind of be architected.
That is the collaboration and I'll know when I see it effect, right?
Yeah. It
Yeah.
was phenomenal, right? And because they were literally standing there and looking at it, and it changed the way that they were thinking about solving the problem. And that actually, so then we built that new thing. Again, I can't talk about any of the details. They came back the next 3 months later. We did 3-month sprints, and they changed it again after that. So what we evolved to in 3 of these sprints was something completely different than what we would have started.
And that's because there was the time and the space for learning and learning from the learning and incorporating that in the feedback, right? And now, like these days, or if the theme is disruption today, right? We can get an app out, in minutes or hours, and getting feedback from customers, and with the whole vibe coding AI thing powering all that, to be able to, it's going to be interesting here in the next few years where we go with all this. And I expect to see lots and lots of disruption if the promises of AI hold true here. So this is going to be really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. But back to what we were talking about before, I think, it's not just the fact that technology allows you to do something different. I think where the real disruptions are going to come again is when you think about what's the problem that you're trying to solve, right? What do your customers want or need to solve a different problem, right? Or to do a different job, like you said before. And what are the assumptions that are keeping you constrained in your current way of thinking, right? You can build progressive. Let's go back to that, right? They could have built an app that just made the claims process go faster afterwards. And maybe they would have been 50% better. Maybe that, would have gotten you, instead of a month-long claims process, you got 2 weeks. But they thought about, do I now use all of that technology to do all that work ahead of time so that I can get it down to 1 hour? Those are 2 different problems. Again, back to what we were talking about before. If the leadership team says, look, I want to disrupt by coming up with a better process, automating the existing process that I have, you still might get disrupted by someone else, right? But if you think, hey, I want to use a disruptive way of thinking and challenge that status quo, that I have to do that work afterwards, and instead invest in I want all that problem solving. I want to solve the problem so that I can do it beforehand. That is going to set your development team in a completely different direction.
With a much different outcome. It's probably a lot more beneficial for shareholders, employees, etc. So, hey, this has been great, Dave. This is the longest episode I've ever recorded. Maybe I'll even split this into 2 parts, but it's all been good stuff. So it's great to see you. Thank you for coming on. We'll may have to continue this discussion. If folks want to get a hold of you, what's your preferred method?
You could just look me up on LinkedIn. Love
Okay.
to hear from you. But Dave, yeah, I mean, again, you're doing some amazing stuff, and thank you for always kind of helping me, think about, again, it's not just the process side, it's the people side. You're really, really in tune with, how can we effectively spend our time, deliberately kind of, using our time to get the most out of our meetings and to solve the right problems. So thanks for all your coaching that you've given me
Hey,
along the way.
my pleasure. And folks, thanks for joining us. Please comment, please like and subscribe. Always love to hear from our listeners and viewers. We're on all the podcast platforms and YouTube and Substacks. Thanks a lot and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, Dave.